Well, Brexit has finally happened. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I want to talk about Brexit, now that it has been achieved, and what a watershed moment this is, not just for the United Kingdom and the EU, but for democracy in general, the rise of populism, and the sovereignty of citizens when it comes to dealing with their own elite. And it was also a major moment in my life as well, because it transitioned me, I think, from being a member of that sort of so-called elite to a more, let's say, working class orientation, at least when it comes to the attitudes towards democracy. Now, before I go on, what I'm going to talk about I know is very sensitive for people. There are many people that are deeply upset that the UK has left the European Union. The last time I talked about this on this channel, people were complaining that the UK had left them with France and Germany, So my Lithuanian friends and others who are part of the EU, who are like, well, now we're stuck with this Franco-Germanic empire. And that's a legitimate complaint, by the way. Britain was a nice kind of spoiler, and if you were Lithuania, you could leverage one against the other, these major states. With Britain leaving, it just leaves one less major player as a decision maker to advance the interests of the minor parties. So that's a legitimate concern. Nevertheless, I want to stress that once the decision to leave the European Union was made, it was absolutely essential to get this done as quickly as possible. And it's been stretched out for years longer than could ever be legitimately justified. So if we go back to June of 2016, there was that watershed moment where the British public voted to leave the European Union against all expectations, polls, predictions, the direction of their own elite class, so the Westminster representatives, the civil service, the business community. They were all saying, well, of course we'll remain in the European Union. It'd be absurd for anyone to suggest that we would leave. And yet, despite that, more people voted in the UK to leave the European Union than had ever voted for anything in the entire history of British democracy. And yet, from almost the very beginning, there was an entire coalition emerging to overturn that result. So David Cameron, former Prime Minister of Britain, he announces there will be a referendum. Now, he did it for a political calculation. He assumed that the Remain case would get up, and the merits of calling for that referendum will be debated for decades to come. But he announced there would be a referendum, and then when the result was against what he had expected and wanted, he announced that he would resign as Prime Minister. Theresa May is voted in, and initially she seemed like a safe pair of hands to guide the Brexit process going forward, because although she was a Remainer in the actual referendum, she seemed to wholeheartedly embrace the verdict as handed down by the British public and said publicly that, look, there's not going to be a second referendum. We're going to leave the European Union, full stop. And so she developed a certain degree of, initially, of confidence amongst the Brexiteers that she was going to deliver on those promises. And then when the Brexit deal that she had arranged was actually put forward, that essentially locked Northern Ireland in the customs union, all these other things that prevented Britain from actually asserting its sovereignty and all the things that people would have voted for in the first place, fisheries, customs duties, even appeals to European courts. All of those things in the initial deal made it utterly untenable for those who supported Brexit to support this deal, and what ultimately led to Theresa May's downfall and the rise of Boris Johnson. But before I go on, let's discuss with some sincerity and some honesty about why people voted to leave the European Union, the UK. Because for many, they will never accept the legitimacy of that vote. They'll always say, oh, they were misled, they didn't know what they were voting for, all these kind of denigrations of Brexiteers as backward and ignorant and silly. And that's totally untrue. You can divide the constituency that voted to leave the European Union I think, into three main categories. First of all, there's the classic Eurosceptics. They're the people that are traditional aristocracy, upper-class Brits, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, current leader of the House, absolute cookie-cutter version of a 17th century aristocrat. And they see things as just the British doing things better. They look back on the British Empire and they look at all the former British colonies, Singapore, those that had colonial influence like India, Australia, the United States, Canada, and they say, well, look, all of these former British colonies are doing extremely well with British institutions, British democracy, representation, liberal democratic norms, compared with the colonial powers that existed at that time. The former Spanish colonies, the former Portuguese colonies, all of those, you could argue, are doing much, much worse than the Asian tigers and the other colonial powers that I mentioned. And so they say, well, look, we don't need the European Union. The European Union needs us. And yes, there's a certain degree of hubris in there, but there's also a degree of confidence that they're, tracing it back to the 13th century Magna Carta, and they can say, look, British democracy is something that was a great gift to the entire world. It was the British Navy that ended slavery. It was the British ingenuity that invented the vaccine, and Isaac Newton's laws of motion, and the Cambridge and Oxford, and all of these institutions that we take as legacy institutions today hark back to things that are quintessentially British. They're not something that you could easily identify with other parts of Europe. The next group, and this is a much, much larger group, although not as politically active, made politically active perhaps by Brexit itself, is the so-called Little Englanders. Now, Little Englanders are something that is used as a term of denigration, small-minded, bigoted, xenophobic, and in fact, it's a term that should be embraced, and I think a lot of people in the UK have embraced that term. And they're simply people who are trying to live their lives, believe that people who they vote for should directly represent them, and otherwise don't have that much political awareness. And I'll tell you one story. Imagine you're a fisherman in Cornwall, okay? And before the European Union comes along, let's say there is a problem with permits and taxation. You want to expand your fleet, you want to employ more people, you want to improve the service delivery and being able to get more fish to port in time and all the rest of it. But you say, look, these regulations are preventing me from doing this in a way that's constructive for me and for my community. Well, what you do is you go to your local MP and you complain about it. You say, these are the issues that I have. The MP looks at it and says, I totally agree with you and I see where you're coming from. I'm going to go argue for your case in Westminster. So that's what they do. And they get a result and the lives of that local community improve. Whereas now, under the EU rules, all too often, that same fisherman would go to the local MP and say, there's nothing I can do. This is a regulation that's determined by the European Union in the European Parliament. And if you want to argue the case, you have to take it to European courts. So that individual has no democratic connection, essentially, with what's happening right across the channel in Brussels. The line between the representation of the European Parliament, which is done on a proportional basis, and an individual member responsible for your personal problem, that link is essentially broken. So people get a feeling that decisions are being made that profoundly affect their lives and livelihood without any democratic representation. It was the whole basis, essentially, of the American Revolution, taxation without representation. Well, that's what the Little Englanders were feeling under the yoke of this Franco-Germanic Empire. The third group are people that I would say are the working class red wall Brits, right? People who had never voted Conservative before in their lives, who make up the entire north of England, who are working class people who are concerned primarily about immigration and the impact on their wages. So they probably had a very positive, or at least a neutral view during the sort of Blairite years towards the European Union. But then the European Union continued to expand. It expanded initially in 2004 and then included like Bulgaria and Romania and places like that in 2007. And you create a Shenzhen area with total freedom of movement. Well, of course, you're going to get mass migration from poorer areas with low wages to rich areas with high wages. So there was a massive influx. I'm not even talking about the immigration from places like Syria and North Africa and places like that. Of course, that's a huge other point, but certainly one that contributes to this issue. But just within the EU itself, having waves of migrant workers coming in by the tens, hundreds of thousands, the only possible impact for those people in those working class areas is to drive down local wages. And it also creates problems for the countries from which these people have departed. You have massive brain drains in Britain, in Bulgaria and Romania and even in Lithuania. Like a lot of people had left, creating a reduction in their population there. People who have high skills, high education, much to offer their local communities. Well, they've gone to Britain and other places where they can get higher wages for themselves and their families. Completely rational. There's nobody's fault. But if you're in that working class area of the UK, you must be feeling pretty dejected since you had no say in this happening in the first place. So if you have that kind of alliance between the old Eurosceptic aristocrats, the little Englanders who are just trying to have democratic control over their own lives, and the working class red wall of the north of England who are concerned about their local wages, combine those together and you had a lot of people, in fact, the majority of people in the UK. And that's the real lesson for the EU. The European project is a great project. It's something that has contributed to, I think it's grossly overstated to say it's the cause, but it's contributed to peace and stability since the end of the Second World War. It has improved cooperation in a sense of pan-European identity, which I think is perfectly fine. But it absolutely needs to socialize to the lowest possible level and the most regional level, democratic control and democratic power, so that people within the countries themselves feel like they still have control over their own lives. And that is totally antithetical to the agendas, the open agendas of the strong Europhiles like Guy Verhofstadt and Michel Barnier, these people that want to centralize power within the EU and turn the EU into the United States of Europe, a supranational entity. I'd put Tony Blair in that category as well. People who want to turn the European Union from an organization of economic cooperation to a new governance structure that absolutely subordinates all the member states as states in this new super state structure called the European Union. That is, without question, their vision, and it's run roughshod over the wishes of ordinary people, not just within the UK, but within Ireland and Portugal and Italy and Spain. Like, there's so many people in that category, and the watershed moment for people leaving the European Union, or Britain in particular, some major countries, that other countries may get the same idea as well. When people started to try and push back against this, and this is when I don't want to say radicalized myself, but became absolutely uncompromising, was when people were pushing for a second referendum. People were saying, people that didn't know what they were voting for, let's check again and see if they wanted to, change their minds. And what this was is nothing short of a direct broadside on the entire concept of democratic sovereignty. There was no argument that justified this, and it was disturbingly mainstream among, highest ranks of the civil service, every academic institution, media outlets around the world. Even in Australia, media were kind of reporting this as if this was a legitimate idea. If you lose an election in a democratic society, you don't say, well, we're going to hold on to power for 4 years and see if people still have changed their mind in 4 years' time. No, you implement the result of that election. And then if you want to revisit that question a generation from now, That's absolutely legitimate. You know, in Australia, we had a Republican debate whether Australia should get rid of the British monarchy and go for a republic. The monarchy won and the republic lost. Everyone accepts that result. Maybe 20 years from that vote, we'll have another vote. That's fine, right? But you don't say, well, actually, we think people got it wrong and we're going to do what we want anyway. That utterly disenfranchises people. And certainly that gave rise to the Brexit Party and Nigel Farage and all of those people who quite legitimately got up to defend democracy. And even if I had voted Remain in the British election, I would have been absolutely uncompromising that with the Leave vote, that had to be implemented. And it was totally reprehensible for people like the Speaker of the House, John Bercow, to even question, let alone openly attempt to thwart that verdict. It was a critical plebiscite of the British people. As I said, more people voted to leave than anyone else in the history of the British public. And it was the most disgusting thing to see the British elite try and overturn that because it wasn't the result that they wanted. And I think that was certainly a canary in the coal mine for Donald Trump and other populist movements around the world. And I don't think that has been fully understood. And what lost me a lot of friends, because I was in that kind of, I don't want to say elite circles, but I was in that circles of people who are generally Remain and generally trying to work out ways, little schemes and Machiavellian plots to keep Britain in the European Union. And I was utterly on the side of the so-called Little Englanders, saying these people have voted to leave. If you believe in democracy, you're duty-bound to implement that as if you had voted for that yourself. And people just looked at me with blank stares as if I was talking some foreign language, that surely this was the worst thing that any British person could ever dream of doing. And I'm like, well, it's not, that's not the point. We live in a democracy. The vote was made, the vote was given, it was freely and fairly entered into, and they legitimately won. And thus needed to be implemented. And the fact that it took so long, the fact that we are here at the end of 2020. So the battery cut out. That's okay. I will stop my rant. Instead, I want to talk about where I see things going forward. There is a thought that because of the rise of China and the United States and the massive titans, that one of the benefits of the EU is that it can negotiate as a massive bloc, and that the UK might be a spoiler for that if it sits outside of the European Union. I don't think that's the case, because the European Union has quite a different relationship with China as the UK does. The UK has a lot of historical baggage to do with, Hong Kong, the Opium Wars, all of these things that are specific to the UK and less acute for some of the other European powers. And secondly, that the UK has and will maintain that special relationship with Washington and won't drift too far from Washington's orbit when it comes to dealing with China. So this actually could be of benefit to the European Union in the sense that there are so many things that the UK would have to veto in terms of doing trade relations with China and other engagements with China simply because of its alliance with the United States. Now, I firmly believe that the European Union should be doing a lot of those things as well, but it would reflect a lot better on the European Union if it wasn't the UK being the one forcibly, saying, look, don't trade with China, don't get dependent on China, don't make the mistakes that Australia has made when it comes to China. It would be good if that came from the Europeans themselves. I think that would be a positive step for the European Union. And also, don't rule out that one day the British public may decide to rejoin the EU. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 30 years, right? So we can for the next generation or so, we can probably write that off. I think the British public will make a go, certainly, of being outside the European Union. What will determine whether there's any chance of Britain coming back to the European Union in the future will be how well the European Union treats the UK. If they treat the UK as an enemy, as a way of warning other countries from leaving and basically trying to run the UK into the ground to make the British public suffer for the fact that they decided to leave, then that would be grossly misreading the mood of the British people and would be harmful both to the UK but also to the European Union itself, with no chance at all that the UK would want to sign up to people that treated them that way. The best way to convince the British public that they should be part of the European project is twofold. One, for the European Union to be a success without hurting Britain directly, and two, with honey. Just remember that you're friends, that the UK leaving the European Union doesn't mean that the UK has left Europe, and that your historical ties certainly outweigh any modern supranational governance project. And if you treat each other with that degree of warmth and affection and mutual respect, then a reformed European Union, a European Union that changes for the better and does more, is more democratically responsive to the needs of the member states and the people within those states, then of course Britain may consider rejoining that. But for now, the UK will, I think, be highly successful on its own, as it has been for centuries in the past. I think the transition arrangements are fair. It allows people to, the fisheries, these sorts of questions of sovereignty. There's a good transition period, so those livelihoods that are being affected on the mainland, the French, the Netherlands, the Spaniards, they will have an opportunity to transition out of those things that are reverting back to exclusively British control over a reasonable period of time. I think 5 years is the term that's been bandied about. And otherwise, I wish both sides the very best of luck. I wish the European Union, as a now exclusively continental organisation, to all the very best. And congratulations to the British public for standing up to your elites, seeing off a disturbing and concerted attempt to overturn your democratic mandate and seeing the result to its conclusion. And I, as I said, lost friends as a consequence of my resolute commitment to standing up for that result, even if it wasn't a result that I personally would have voted for, though I never had that opportunity, and would do so to the ends of the earth. I think that's absolutely critical, and that gives an opportunity for Britain to heal and to unite and to move on. With that said, congratulations to everybody, best of luck, and I will see you in the next video.